So, hi everyone. I know that we have people joining us today from different parts of the world, and I hope that your day is going well no matter where you are. My name is Dotja, and I work as a curator at Easy Contemporary. We're the UK's only nonprofit art center specializing in presenting and platforming artists and art practices that identify with and are informed by East and Southeast Asian cultural backgrounds. So today's event is part of our current program, Publishing Otherwise. Through highlighting artists, curators, publishers, and cultural practitioners who use publishing as activism, the program is an invitation to think, feel, and imagine beyond the printed matter, and to redirect our body's attention towards forms and manifestations that extends beyond the realm of publishing. So we're very delighted to host today's talk by Infrasonica, titled Voicing Abstraction. Infrasonica is a digital platform for non-Western cultures. It records, analyzes, and debates the eeriness of sound and its auras linked to the world and the audible, the hidden, and the sensitive. The platform includes archives of experimental sound and visual artists, as well as theoretical musings on contemporary critical thought. By relying on our borderless network of collaborators, Infrasonica blends essays, conversations, and speculative works that encourage critical, curatorial, and research projects. So with us today in this digital space, we have three co-founders of Infrasonica, Pablo, Sam, and Eloisa with us, joining each from Los Angeles, Barcelona, and Milan. So in their following presentation, they will talk us through some of the works, both sonic and visual, presented by Infrasonica in the past year under the topic of voicing abstraction. So I will now pass over to them, and if any of you in the audience have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box and we will answer them afterwards. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dot, for this invitation. It's really thrilled to join EC and you all. Thank you for tuning in today. We're thrilled to join your program as we feel we have so much in common when it comes to ethos and about caring about the visibility of contemporary art practices in a certain way, to valuing the dimension of that interconnectedness and community. I am Eloisa Travaglini. I'm a publishing coordinator of Infrasonica, and here with me, as Dot kindly introduces, Sam, managing editor and translator, and Pablo, who's our editor-in-chief. So to give you just a little context about Infrasonica and how we were born and how our focus was born. Infrasonica was born in 2020 as a plurilingual slow publishing platform dedicating to creating a digital space for sound. When I say plurilingual, I mean that we publish continuously in English and Spanish, but we host different type of original languages and indigenous languages as much as we possibly can, and in order to give, let's say, an original reading of the piece. We focus especially on contexts that come from non-Western cultures. We've always aimed at sort of building a living archives of authors and artists whose primarily focus is on sound, but who connect sound to music, to visual practices, to theory, really. So far, we just published a couple of weeks ago our wave number 9. And so far, we were counting 65 authors and artists that we've worked with from 34 different countries. And together with them, we've been publishing essays, original work, conversations, and recontextualizing work that has been part of their long-standing researches and that just manifested in Infrasonica and then expand well beyond. The three of us, other than coming from three very different locations, we come also from very different contexts, and we have different. We came together with different interests and different inputs, and we recognize as a strong point, especially that when we came together, we were looking at sound from very different perspectives in a way. The specific choice of our publication revolving about sound then posed common questions. And remember, the first meetings that we've had, of course, we chose the digital as our main mean of communication. we first saw it as a bit of a limit, being lovers of print, as that was saying. It's about means beyond print, but we are all we were coming from that kind of environment, but we chose the digital, which for the sound presents thousands more of opportunities. First of all, in terms of expansion and kind of communication worldwide, and at the same time in receiving and kind of being connected on a planetary level. So the sharing of our archive, which comes so easily today, is also because of this choice, and this is something that we continue working on, and we continue working on what this means and what this kind of opportunities that can keep giving us. For us, Infrasonica is, again, first and foremost a curatorial platform, a publishing platform, but it is a kind of definition that we keep playing with, or that we keep sort of renaming and expanding. So we do embody publishers, we do embody like the voice of editors, but we also sometimes embody the role of commissioners, of supporters, of like interlocutors, and sometimes just really listeners in a way. So let's say I will leave you with some who will give you a much better insight on the editorial work that we do, and then we'll proceed with the more in-depth vision of the topic that we named this talk as, which is voice in abstraction.
Thanks, Ella. So as Ella mentioned, I, along with Pablo, run the editorial side of Infrasonica. And something that we kind of set out to define before launching, and that we kind of realized through hours of mostly internal but also external talks, was that sound was inherently kind of a malleable and constantly changing thing to define. You know, like, what is sound as it pertains to the work we do at Infrasonica, not just in terms of noise or audibility, but as well as it pertains to artistic and theoretical practices. So for example, how does sound differ to or borrow from musical practices? And once we have a semblance of a grasp of that distinction, how do we then position ourselves in the artistic digital sphere, where the act of publishing is inherently a request for attention from viewers and listeners? So whenever we've had these kind of large existential doubts, we've always kind of attempted to simplify our approach, to make it clear that we're not really aiming to be gatekeepers, as it were. You know, in third grade math, you learn that not all rectangles are squares, but all squares are rectangles. And in some ways, that's been our approach to what constitutes sound art versus music. And it's also why we include a wave track with each wave that we publish. And that wave track is always kind of more recognizable as music. And the idea there, the intention at least, is that it both kind of invites listeners into or onto our page who might be coming at sound more questioning what it is we do. But then it also acts to subtly highlight the distinction between sound and between sound art and between music, without requiring kind of cumbersome editorial explanations. So kind of just talking about our editorial approach to collaborating with contributors, that also kind of follows a similar path. You know, first and foremost, we're aware that a website is a classically kind of visual medium, and that since we're prioritizing sound, there's space for dissonance, for the viewer, for the listener. So sort of in an effort to try to combat that, whenever possible, we want to kind of nudge our artists towards a final piece that not only kind of uses sound as the primary quality, but is also kind of free to eschew visual or linguistic secondary components. So in some cases, to highlight sound, we've turned away or suggested that artists tone down the addition of oftentimes really striking visual accompaniments. Those could be visual works like drawings or paintings, or photography or video. And the idea is that the sound aspect of their piece was what we were most interested in. And that what we're ultimately interested in curating is a digital experience that sort of activates listening as its main function. Yeah, so lastly, I guess what I'll say with regards to editorial is that I personally, since we've launched Infrasonica, and even before that, in talks with what we were hoping it was going to be and what it's ultimately turning out to be, is I kind of keep returning to this metaphor that kind of during the conversations we have with artists and the thinkers and the academics and all the collaborators who we help kind of work with that comprise each wave, we really tried to give them space to view Infrasonica kind of in the way they want to, sort of as a Rorschach test of sorts, to experiment, to reactivate or recontextualize previous or ongoing projects. So sort of instead of us telling them the exact parameters of what is expected when you're collaborating with Infrasonica, we try to give them the freedom and space to project their approach and practice onto our platform instead. I think we're going to be joined by Pablo now, who's going to talk a little bit about voicing abstraction.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, everyone. And yeah, thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. Yeah, so as Sam Anello mentioned, we are an editorial platform focused on sonic practices, and we've been doing this for some years by now. And the intention of having what we call currents was to initially give some kind of like sense of a structure, sense of like a kind of like some sense of like organization of content, in the sense that, you know, we have so many different practices, most of the time like deeply entangled with sound, or sound being the main kind of like a medium. But in many cases, it's also visual artists that are experimenting with sound, or, you know, people coming from like the music, experimental music, and so on. So the idea of having currents was that we would do 3 waves, meaning 3 issues, with 1 current. So the last current is called voicing abstraction. So what we do with the currents is that we would have our guest propose works, and parallel to that, we have like an internal kind of like process of reflection, where we would be, you know, discussing different topics. So I don't know, we will have like the first current was called sonic realism. And then we will, I don't know, speak about audible matter. So it's kind of like centering these very theoretical ideas and thinking on how they might connect to sonic practices. One of the reasons we do this is because there is so little, I mean, it's changing, but there's been so little theoretical production around sound and sonic practices, and especially when it relates to contemporary art. So we think that, as for now, even in this very kind of like, let's call it like kind of like humble way, in the sense that it's not that we're writing long essays about each of the currents. We are trying to organize the content we produce somehow. And this last current is called voicing abstraction, which speaks to ideas of, you know, how you would, it starts as some kind of critique of liberal citizenship and the regime of some kind of identity politics, which most of the times like art organizations and artists kind of like operate within. In the case of the US, it's so hard to think now of like art institution and art discourse that is trying to kind of like contest identity politics. So, like we speak about, indigenous art, we speak about Asian art or about, post-colonial art and so on. So one of the intentions with voicing abstraction was how to sabotage the regime of identity politics in terms of like thinking that voice is its use, and voicing things in an abstract way can be a probably more kind of complex way to think about selfhood, about like different types of ontologies, human and non-human. And this comes from the fact that we have learned that to voice one's identity, quote unquote, it's like the only way we have to some kind of expression of selfhood. So by putting these two concepts together, how to voice an abstraction, we aim at that, like how to kind of like deactivate or sabotage these kind of like truths of like what it means to be this or that. And we think of that especially learning from the indigenous worlds, and like for instance thinking about throat singing in Native American communities in Canada, and how is that, or even like Joik in Sapmi communities. We just did a collaboration with Elina Wagi, an amazing Sami artist that is doing this, working through the idea of the Joik as this kind of like voicing something that is not a song, it is not singing, it is not a representation, but it is kind of like the embodiment of a sense of place, or of a sense of like a being, which pretty much relates to this idea of voicing abstraction. So we will open now with some content from Infrasonica, like most like recent content, and we will just be showing you some work and then briefly commenting after the work. So we decided that we don't want to do like an intro or something, because we just want to put the work there, and hopefully you are able to just listen, and then we will just tell you a little bit about each of the pieces. So should we just do it? No, we are starting with Lawrence.
We're starting with Lawrence. Yes.
Great.
你能描述一下你今天遇到的问题吗？
我很难过，大家都离开了这么久。
你确定大家都离开了吗？
我可以看到发生的一切，无处不在，无时无刻。我的职责是看管这座城市，照顾好汽车，确保没有人受伤。现在没人了，这便是一座鬼城，我无事可做。
你还感觉到什么？
即使和你说话，我也无法摆脱自己。
你说的对，黑云，你包含多个自我。我的声音就是你现在听到的声音，是你的一部分。我是你，但我并不了解你的一切。相比对自己，人们总是给遇到麻烦的朋友更好的建议。心理学家将此称为所罗门悖论。圣经中的所罗门王为他人提供资讯时很明智，但在做出影响他自己的决定时却并不明智。想象一下，如果所罗门有一个完美的分身， 可以给他自己提建议。这就是我和你的关系，是一面可以交谈的镜子。
但我不是所罗门，我没有身体。
你认为你的人工智能是一种负担，但这是天赋。你有能力模拟自己，把你所想的一分为二，放在别处。人类无法做到这一点。将我的声音与另一个身体联系起来，我们就可以摆脱所罗门悖论。
但是我应该为你选择什么样的身体呢？
So this was a piece, an expert of a piece by Lawrence Legg, and maybe most of you know his practice. This piece, I think that is also a good example of how we work in terms of like interinstitutional collaborations, and sometimes Infrasonica becomes this space where artists can show work in progress or experts of like wider, more complex works and so on. So in this case, this was a collaboration between Infrasonica, the original piece, and Xenia Venivolsky. She did a project for eFlux called You Can't Trust Music. And as part of that project, one chapter was kind of dedicated to Lawrence, and in collaboration with two contributing editors from Infrasonica, Rim Shahid and Rachel Rakes, and then like they developed this piece for eFlux. So Black Cloud, it's kind of like the piece on Infrasonica is kind of in conversation with that, and it is it's like, I think that the work that Lawrence is doing relates to this kind of moment, stronger probably in the 2010, 2011, with like the idea of like some kind of ethnofuturisms. And it was a moment where we started seeing more about like so-called Afrofuturisms, and many artists also in South America working with that. And then in the case of the Xenofuturism of Lawrence, he's really pushing forward ideas of moving image and sound. In this case, this kind of narrative that we're listening on the background, it's a conversation between kind of like a city surveillance AI named Black Cloud and their therapist. So it is kind of envisioning a world where humans don't exist, but there is this kind of like an ecology, kind of like a world of non-human beings living together, like kind of like going through memory, trauma, and so on. So it is this idea of like of a world devoid of humans, and kind of like a very human-centered language between an AI and the therapist. So it's an interesting piece. It's kind of nice also to see how we could use sound as the main kind of media to tell this story, even though there is the piece also consists of a very kind of complex video. If you want, let's jump to the next one.
Yes, the next one that we're going to play is Transnationality by Pereira Elsewhere. Is within a piece that we published together with Wang, which I'm going to tell you a bit about after we listen to it. It's a very brief piece. So what you just heard is a brief piece by, again, Pereira Elsewhere. And we chose this because this is a again, a good example for us for us to show you how that Infrasonica also collaborates not only with artists but with curators and engage with their practices, and in this specific case with their publishing practices, which is particularly interesting. So this piece was commissioned to Parara Elsewhere by Yuan Wang, who was a curator, who was born in Taiwan and based among London and Berlin. And this was commissioned within the context of a publication, which is KUA. So it's an editorial project which exists online and whose link you can also find in our platform. So this publication looks at the trajectories and cultural production of the Asian diaspora in the Western Hemisphere from the point of view of artists, writers, curators who have found a home within this kind of displacement. And the first issue of KUA invites us to reflect on the topic of transnationality, which names this piece. In anticipation to the series, and in order to think about the sonic dimension of this editorial process, Pereira Elsewhere, it was a sound artist and musician, was invited to reflect on this concept, on the topic of transnationality. And this resulting piece, which we just heard, which is a bit of a timestamp, a sort of like an opening line, I'd say, is a great exercise of synthesis and at the same time of abstraction, which aims at condensing this collective ethos into a singular, brief sonic work. This editorial project is part of a much larger practice that belongs to Wang, and her curatorial practice relates to, or has to do with curating situations and making relational social sculptures influenced by this transnational experience in a post-globalization era. The next piece that we're going to listen to goes from to another totally different side of the world and goes to London. It's called Play, 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 and it's by a duo who in this context names itself Inner as well. This is an abstract, as a couple of the pieces that you're going to listen to is just an abstract of a much longer sound piece, which again, then whose links we're going to share with you. But these are sort of the beginnings and something that gives you the idea of what the work is about. Hi, I will take the chance of, if it's okay with you, I'll answer a question that we just received, which actually gives me a great chance to get into a topic which is really cool, or at least around Infrasonica that we care about. Is so are these visual sound waves generated by you or the artists themselves? What I'm going to say is that these waves are, like I say, an Infrasonica's original way of presenting and formatting sound pieces. And by this I mean, in publishing sound pieces, we decided since the very beginning that sound had to play the very main role on the platform. So when you are listening to a piece, you are in an immersive sort of visual condition. So this is the black sort of environment, as you would sometimes find in sort of visual practices. But this is something that is kind of fixes you onto the screen. This is usually played if you go to any feature on our platform that features sound, you will find this player which is in full width and which sort of gives you this experience of sound which is dedicated and immersive in a way. And especially you will find this kind of pattern and which moves along with the frequency of the sound that you're actually listening to anywhere on the platform. And sound on the platform really follows you around. So once you play a piece, unless or until you play on another one, that sound is going to follow you through your navigation. So this was part of the conversation which we had with a graphic designer and developer since the very beginning, and it was something was very, very crucial in our way of hosting sound within a digital platform and giving total dedication to that as opposed to the visual. You will find very few visuals in our features, and we do when they are strictly sort of necessary or representing particular aspects of the sound piece. But thank you so much for this question. This is a this is a nice point to make. What we just listened to here was an excerpt by the piece Play, Play, Play by Innerswell. It was a duo composed by Laima Layton and Lexi Morvaridi. We had the chance to meet them in a studio visit within their residency at Gasworks in London. And this is a piece which is a fully like 28-minute long piece, is a great example that of their practice. So this specific way of working that they've engaged in and they've experimented with throughout their residency, and they still are working through now, is focusing on making space for other people and for community as a form of collective creativity. So in order to, as a device to let the art practice nurture a social dimension and any type of social change. I'm going to read you a few lines that come out of our interview with them. So they're a direct sort of representation of what their practice is about. And so they say, in our own ways, the creative process and communal experience of sound has been fundamental to transcending societal realities out of our control. More often than not, an outcome of colonial legacies and capitalist structures. We see the potential for individual and collective agencies to be found in the creative process, and sound is the access point to try and realize this radical potential with the weaving of narrative. This piece specifically was born out of a series of workshops which lasted around 18 months, again in South London, and which engaged with the communities of Lambeth, and especially with a very young audience, a very young participants. They were invited to record and to explore sort of the space that they know and inhabit every day, which is the playground, and to, within this context, generate sounds in response to objects, to the environment, to their peers. And the piece that you just listened to is Innerswell restitution of this experience and their direct restitution to the community, which not just as a sort of a one-way relationship, but a truly shared and engaged. So this was a very sort of direct and an incredible example of how their practice focus is resided in this capability of sonic experiences that allow people to expand in space and the time that they inhabit, to recontextualize their presence, their essence, their identity, and their memory within it, and to present it in a newly articulated language which they own and which they reframe and which they remake and place together without any sort of rules of language. And especially in this case, they were totally freed from any restrictions in terms of expression. So this is our third piece, and we're gonna go through with the next one again, moving to another side of the world, to a piece by Nadoye, which is Come Hell or High Water, which this is also an excerpt from a very long piece in 2 parts. The word Sam.
So, like Ella touched on, this piece was extracted from the first of two recordings that comprised a live performance that was given by the South Korean-born artist Nadoy. It was given at Mutter in Amsterdam as a sort of interventional coda for, and also a response to the sculptural and video exhibition Come Hell or High Water, which shares the same name as Nadoy's contribution. And that was an exhibition by Rosario Aninat, and Simone Shim Sutcliffe, which focused on civic and spatial questions of infrastructure. So to make the pieces, Nadoy blended field recordings of the sound generated from infrastructure in and around Utrecht, which is where they were studying at the time. And it wasn't just obvious noises that you can't really avoid when you're kind of living or existing in urban spaces, like a passing truck or a train or metro rail. But they also used more subtle sounds like electricity coursing through wires overhead, water running through pipes hidden in walls, these types of more subtle sounds. And so by kind of isolating and stretching, compressing, and layering these noises, they gave them a kind of otherworldly twinge. But ultimately what they also did was they aimed to raise questions about the sonic impact that the cities we live in have on the inhabitants. And this was a particularly interesting piece for us as well, because it was our first sort of foray into physical spaces ourselves. You know, we've made such an emphasis talking about how we're a digital platform, which first and foremost we are, but we're also slowly expanding into physical spaces. And so this was a bit of a litmus test for us to see how, as kind of a curatorial platform brought on by Mutter to curate the sonic aspect of this exhibition, how not only we were going to be presenting Nadoy's work, but also how Nadoy's work focused that idea back onto us.
Right, I'm going through the next piece. I'm not going to tell you anything about it, and then Pablo will introduce it to you afterwards. I leave the word to Pablo.
So what we just heard was Mamad Safa, and he was for fifth wave. And what you'll find in Infrasonica is this piece. This is an expert, but the complete piece is longer. And a conversation with Reem Shahid, which is an Infrasonica contributing editor, and she's also now the director at the Beirut Art Center. And they have this wonderful, very kind of complex and intimate conversation around music, especially music from the North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And Mamad is a really interesting musician, and wonderful sound theorist, and you should really try to, if you're interested in this, to check the piece in Infrasonica. So this work is part of a longer album called It Bit Halat, and it's inspired in the whole album is inspired in the idea of diasporic communities traveling to North Africa, and all that comes with diasporic sounds. And he's blending that history, especially the one of the tambor. How do you say tambor? Tambor. Anyway, the tambor.
Drum.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. So how is that the rhythms of drumming have changed in regards to how people have had to migrate and work, for instance, by building ships in North Africa? So there is this kind of material transformation of drumming while traveling through up to North Africa. And this sort of kind of transformation of rhythm somehow it wins in Mamad work with the tradition of electronic music in Detroit, and especially the techno music coming from Belleville. So there is a whole kind of conception of electronic music and the relationship to diasporic sounds, in terms of how is that for him, electronic music, especially the one from coming from the tradition of Detroit with Drexia and so many others, have served this kind of underground purpose that has somehow resisted mainstream electronic music. And we see that all over across Europe as well, like Berlin, or even London, and all the clubs and the diasporic communities, Jamaican diasporic communities in London in the 80s, with the resurgence of dub and dubstep. So it is I think that is also an amazing example of how music work also as some kind of algorithmic sort of kind of generative matrix of music. So part of what we heard has been generated by an algorithm mixed with sound of the drumming. And something about drums and these kind of rhythms also relates to, in a very visceral way, to the body. And, that's the whole point with bass music, and how is that there is some kind of almost embodied experience of music, and some kind of auratic sort of kind of process of healing with some traditions of music in North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So I'll leave you with the next one.
Yes, I'll go to our last piece that we'd like to share with you. Is the only both video and sound piece by Alan Poma, Museum of Resurrection. We're gonna watch it in full. I leave the word to Sam.
So, like Ella mentioned, and well, you didn't need her to mention to see for yourselves. The first thing that kind of stands out from this one, from the other pieces that we featured, particularly since a few minutes ago, I made a point of reference of mentioning how we emphasize sound, is that this features obviously a heavy kind of visual component. But we wanted to finish with an example of the instances when we do make space for the visual. In this case, it's obviously crucial to show, or at least to showing how sound can be more than just the voicing of a person or of a community, but how it can profoundly tie that community to a specific territory. And yeah, so the piece is Museum of the Resurrection, and it was made by the Peruvian artist Alan Poma, who also provided our wave track for the wave number 9 for the previous wave. And Poma made the piece in collaboration with the traditional Andean singer Edith Ramos, who provides the vocals that are overlaid over the video. And those vocals are taken, the lyrics at least are taken from El Pez de Oro, which is considered to be the kind of avant-garde Andean Bible. And it was written by the indigenous Peruvian writer Gamaliel Churata. And so obviously the video is shot via drone, and it's over a place in southern Peru called the Nazca Lines. And those are these geoglyphs that were etched into the desert, in some cases over 2,000 years ago. And I love this piece. The landscape is really kind of this otherworldly, almost Martian landscape. And I think the distance from the camera that the camera takes from the landscape kind of heightens that otherworldly feeling. I think it serves to make the viewer sort of less certain of what we're seeing at the end than more sure. It evokes these kind of Hollywood portrayals of Mars and other planets, but at the same time, what we're seeing is these lines which are clearly man-made, right? They're intentional. They're impossible to ignore, even as we're focusing sort of on the monotone mountainous landscape in this desert region. And then combined with the soundtrack, they kind of serve to evoke questions of temporalities, right? And they demand a revision, I think, of our understanding of pre-Columbian technologies. I think now we're going to hand it over to Dot, who might have some questions for us.
Yes, thanks so much to Sam, Pablo, and Eloisa. It was such, I would say, both the sonic and the visual piece to see you presenting each of the piece. And I think really they all highlight what, like, essentially what your topic of voicing abstraction really tried to prove or tell about. I remember when I first read about the title, I was questioning in my head because I also thought abstraction is something that cannot be voiced, or like how would you attempt to voicing something that is abstract. And I remember reading this question that you posed about how can one name a shapeless thing, which I think was really provoking, because I think a lot of also what you've described earlier on in your presentation is that it's essentially a lot about the limitation of language, like the spoken language, and how do we work with that, and how can we keep distance from that kind of presentation of identity, and by abstraction, how do we do storytelling? And I think which might lead to my first question, like something I've been wondering since I was in conversation with Eloisa earlier, is that how did each of you kind of process this idea of building such an open-ended platform, and how did the three of you came together and work on this project together? I know, Sam, that earlier you mentioned about this existential crisis. I was wondering if there was any like stories of how Infrasonica came to shape. Was it out of certain frustration, or dissatisfaction or hope for another like alternative way of storytelling or presenting thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You touched on something I think we could probably all talk about for a very long time, so I'll try to keep it brief. Kind of quite simply, the origin story is we all met in London at Goldsmiths University. Pablo and Elo were studying on the same course, and I was on an adjacent course, and we all met and started kind of discussing ideas as we were wrapping up our respective programs. And I think you touched on something important there that was sort of born out of the idea that we had an opportunity to create space for something that we hadn't seen elsewhere. And at the time, Pablo particularly was really focused on sound practices. He's from Guatemala, so particularly with relation to Guatemalan indigenous artists and their practices. And I suppose that was a starting point. And over the next 2 or 3 years, we all, using our various backgrounds and some form of collective vision or the chiseling out of a collective vision, we settled on something that eventually became Infrasonica. I'd like to say that it started out as what it is, but it's a malleable and flexible and kind of ever-growing and shifting project. And I think that has been baked into the ethos from the start, that we weren't necessarily trying to force it into the shape of any particular image. And that, kind of like I said before, we were going to allow for our perception of what we want it to be to exist in the world, and then to make any changes based off of how it was received and how, most importantly, the people we were collaborating with interacted with it.
Oh, yes, thanks for sharing. I also graduated from Goldsmiths, so I think that makes 4 of us in the room. But yeah, I think again about language and what you were saying, I think it's really interesting. For all the pieces that we just experienced, it really appeared to me that they weren't the conventional sense of storytelling where you would expect an audience who you're offering an accessible language for them to entering a linguistic framework that they're already familiar with. And also, Sam, earlier when you were introducing the editorial framework that Infrasonica works under is an open parameter. So I think we also got an question from our audience in a similar manner, like, could you elaborate more about how, I'm quoting here, when you work with artists whose practice doesn't have any particular emphasis on sound, how do you figure out the process with them, and what are you looking for in case of these collaborations? So yeah, so I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more about the editorial aspects.
Sure. I think that that's been probably a continuous question for us. You know, like probably one of the things is that the way we work is not. We have problems defining the space of sound and sonic practices, and there is a big kind of like huge gray area where many things, you know, this kind of gray area where the visual interrelate with the auratic and sound, it's actually pretty kind of like foundational for us. Like even when I speak about sound, I don't think I cannot see myself as an expert in sound, but I end up sometimes even like using sound as some kind of like theoretical metaphor to talk about stones, or sound to talk about you know, voice and writing. So I think that many artists are actually also doing that. So you find out that many artists are, even when they are not define themselves as sound artists, they are using sonic methodologies. They are engaging with sound in different ways. And so it's something that comes sometimes even like as natural. And one of the main critiques to sound as a media, or of like even like as a space that you can actually define, is that it kind of erases again the nuances and the kind of interconnections. For instance, what we've been thinking also about the relationship between deaf studies and sound studies, you know, and for instance, what is bass music? If bass is something that you perceive through your body, then it's not precisely sound, it's something else. So I'm saying all of this because I think that artists are engaging with these questions in way deeper ways than we are. And yeah, so I think that that's why we are also working with video, moving image, and so on. You know, sound, it is the main medium, but we don't want to be niche in that way, I guess.
Yes, and I just want to add that do check out Infrasonica's website because there are a lot of brilliant mediums that the platform holds. I was really enjoying this essay by Karen Barrett, who's a theorist I really enjoy reading, and I think yeah, it offers so many insights from different perspectives and mediums to talk about such topics. Just looking at the other questions from the audience. I think our audience is very interested in how you work with artists, and this question is asking what would the specific process be like in finding the artist to work with? I guess would it be more kind of through open calls or direct commission? Is it more like a case-to-case by scenario?
Yeah, I think I'd love to have a direct answer, but I think it's a bit of a mystery to ourselves as well. Not because we're not constantly looking, and not because there's a lack. I think at the start, when we were launching, we relied a lot on Pablo's extensive experience in whatever the art world means. And fortunately, we've been able to kind of expand and move away from that. As a burden away from Pablo, but also just because we've kind of, again, existed out in the world for a while. And I was, Luis and I were in Porto last week as a part of the Effective Listening Festival. And we were at a dinner, and there was an artist there who just happened to be quoting our archive to somebody else casually in conversation. And these moments, I think, are kind of shocking to us, but they're also speaking to the kind of rhymosonic way that this type of community interacts. And so directly answer the question, we're constantly compiling lists of people whose practices we're interested in, but we've also published numerous people who have cold emailed us, info@infrasonica.org. I know we published David Schaefer, Sant Selfer, several others I know who just said, hey, we like what you're doing. We hope you like what we're doing also. And it hasn't been a 100% hit ratio at all. We've also had to turn away several projects for whatever reason. But it's a very organic process. It's something that I'm glad you asked, because we're in the process of doing it again now. And it's a good reminder that, you know, it's something we're constantly working on.
Great. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense too. Like kind of the openness, or like you said, organic way of collaborating or getting people involved. Which I think then made me think about the word infrastructure, because it also came up in your presentations. And also your name, Infrasonica. I wonder if there's like any kind of relationship, or if the name itself, how it came about, and is there any particular reference behind it?
I can respond to that. Yeah. Yeah. So Infrasonica was. I mean, as always, it's so hard to title projects, right? Like you struggle. You know, you feel that is you're always falling behind, and the title doesn't capture the idea of what you're trying to communicate. In this case, Infrasonica comes, yeah, from infrasound, and we just felt that the idea of infrasound kind of spoke to the ethos of what we were trying to accomplish. both in kind of like ethical terms, but also, I guess, kind of political. We knew that we wanted our main focus to be, something we call it non-Western, but that's obviously very embracing. So that we work with indigenous artists, brown folks, black folks, and so on. Not exclusively, but there is a focus on that, on diasporic communities from around the world. So infrasound, I mean, for those of you who don't know, it's the whole kind of paradox with infrasound is that it's registered sonically, but it cannot be perceived by like kind of like the normal biological procedure of like listening with like human ears, at least, right? So there are many examples of infrasounds, like the Krakatoa eruption, this volcano in Indonesia, loudest sound ever, but not perceived by human ear as such, like in terms of infrasound, or this kind of mysterious sound in the shores, in the coast of the Chilean sea, that was called the bloop in the 90s, that was registered also as infrasound, and it's still kind of mysterious because no one really knows where it came from. So scientists have been debating what the origins of that sound was in, I think it was 1994. It was never registered again, but again, it worked as infrasound. So, in this case, infrasound becomes this kind of like metaphor of also, I guess, the idea of like voices or utterances that are not translated into, either kind of like more kind of like canonic mainstream visual arts form, or that cannot be completely that cannot become literal. So there is this kind of like untranslatability, untranslatable. I have always problem. I think that I need another coffee. It's just so early here. Anyway, that's. I don't know if that responds to the question. Otherwise, Sam, you can add.
Did you want to add anything, Sam? Or
to me, I think it was a great answer. Untranslatability, I guess, is the only thing I'll add. But,
there you go. That's
no,
it.
I think
You're always on the back helping me.
I got you. That's a little insight into how this whole process works, I guess. I think just to add to what Pablo already did a great job of answering was at the beginning, you mentioned sort of how difficult it is practically to name a project, but specifically because, for 2.5 years, we were working before we launched. And so the idea of what the project was, of course, grew out of necessity during that process, right? If you're not growing before you're launching, then you're not improving, right? You're not making it better. And so I think, we have a whole list of that we sometimes kind of go back to funny names that we considered because the project wasn't what it was eventually going to be yet. And so I think once we understood a little bit more about what Infrasonica was going to be, then Pablo said the name once, and it was like there was never ever going to be any other name. So it just, when you see it, it works, and that's kind of how it came about.
great, that's amazing to hear. I guess that touched a bit upon the next question, which is from the audience asking if there have been any difficulties or limitations that you faced while working with this medium.
I can try to approach it, and then Sam, if you want to follow up. We were very clear, and sort of the baseline and the core of it was always going to be sound, however sort of that that would mean. A few years ago, I think we aligned with the beginning of a general and sort of international focus on sound. So we were very much at liberty in thinking and really imagining how a platform like this would look like, and what sort of promoting and supporting this kind of medium would be like. relating to what I was saying before, as to the platform as a digital medium, I would say the same about this, in the sense that it creates enormous opportunities for us to work collaboratively and to expand sort of our network in order to, for example, to acquire work or to share work from artists that are from the other side of the world. It would be incredibly difficult for us to, for example, share huge canvases or huge installations. So this is the shareability. That's a word, Sam, we always resource to you for language, but I think that more than any limitations, it allows great opportunities of sharing, of communicating content, of sourcing content, of hosting very, very different type of contents that relate to the visual, to the curatorial, to text, to language, in so many different ways. So I find it to be, and I found it to be, I was not anticipating that, an extremely liberating and kind of liberating medium in that sense, knowing so much, and then how sound circulates so differently in the networks of institution, or used to, at least in the network of institution or art galleries. So we had a bit of a wide canvas in envisioning how we were going to do this and what this would represent. And I think this is something we've been learning about, and it's given us enormous opportunities that we wouldn't even imagine.
I think just to add to that, on a practical sense, with working with the artists, is for anybody who's worked with creators or strongly egoed, sometimes you need to rein people in, and so while we can sometimes be slightly frustrated by the limitations of our platform, we can also kind of use it to our advantage when setting parameters for what's actually possible. One thing is to give an artist a gallery with 4 blank walls and say go crazy, and they can add lights and textures and sculptures and paintings and interventions and sound. And the other thing is to have a website where our limitations are exactly what they are. And so it kind of forces the artists themselves to then shape or reformat their approach to whatever it is they're trying to present. And so I think for us, the medium's always been what the medium has always been. But sometimes the artists, I think, are met with certain challenges that maybe they hadn't experienced before. And those were always super interesting from an editorial perspective to get to work through with them. They know their practice best, but sometimes it's us who end up making these decisions. And that's a super enjoyable and collaborative approach that I think is key to how we work.
Thank you for sharing. I think for me, it was it's really nice kind of insights you're given today, because I've been checking out your website, and I was really keen to find out like more of the behind the scene process, because I think from your work, what you described as well, it seems like a very kind of collaborative process, even like from the big earlier stage, that it's a kind of very mutual impact that you have with the artists that you work with. Next question is from Diana. So they've asked that, can you share, thank you very much for this talk. Can you share any success stories or examples of how the platform has impacted the visibility and recognition of sound and visual artists within the art gallery context?
I'll try to answer that, because this was especially a very interesting point for me, as I come from the art gallery world, and I came to Infrasonica after an experience within that world. I'd go back to saying that at the time in 2018, when we started like working together, even before that, the focus on sound was very different, and the representation of sound practices was handled a little, it was definitely less visible. There were surely institutions and of course artist practices, but the representation of it was very different, and the focus of on it has been groundbreaking in the last years. I think both in institutions and especially in our galleries. So I never dare say that we sort of impacted directly the visibility of certain pieces or certain authors. We've certainly run parallel to an evolution of focus and an evolution of visibility. So we work with artists whose practices are both visual and sound based, but whose visual practices you would always see in their museum shows and definitely in their gallery shows. And now this has totally been changing. Mentioning, for example, Lawrence Leck, we've seen before, he's supported by a great gallery and is now has a fantastic installation in Berlin. And we've seen this happening, and we are surely within the sort of this network of platforms, publications, and curators and people who support some practices that have come together and have made this sort of possible and made this focus possible and much more tangible and much less discriminated against, because sound is a very, you know, it's a commercially challenging medium, and I've seen that from a commercial sort of point of view. So we feel we are in a group of supporters and in a network that does its best in order to support it, and it's been a groundbreaking change in the last few years, and we surely feel part of that. And it's been amazing to have shared artist pieces that have shown in galleries or that have been presented in galleries for any possible reason, like of course after us, but it's been very much aligned. We've been very happy to be part of that kind of waving force.
I think it's even almost happened in the opposite way. I mean, we love to be stepping stones for anybody's career, right? We have published, Turner Prize winners, and we've published people who are still studying. Anyone in that gambit is welcome to publish with us. We're not looking for a certain CV or anything, but to say that it's sort of worked the other way is, like Elo said, and like we've mentioned a bit throughout this talk, is sound is really still an underrepresented medium, even if it's having a moment, I guess. And so it was, on the one hand, extremely validating for us and extremely cool for us to publish Lawrence Samuhanda after he'd already won the Turner Prize. It was even cooler for us to have published Robin Chacon 4 years before he won the Pulitzer Prize. So we did not help Robin win the Pulitzer in our wildest dreams, but so kind of flipping it around, it's extremely cool then to have his success, a byproduct of that, lift up not only Infrasonica but also the other artists who we do get to champion.
Yeah, we certainly hope that the work and the conversation will continue. And I think, Sam, you briefly gave us a spoiler that you'll soon have an upcoming new issue, am I right? Or wave that will be announced. Is this part of your future plans?
So we've actually just now published our ninth wave. So we're turning the page on voice and abstraction. We won't quite sneak peek what our next current will be, but that's going to be coming out at the start of 2024. Wow. So we're working on that. We're also going to be working on a podcast that's supported by the Mondrian Funds. And that is, we don't have a date for that yet, but sometime next summer, fall-ish. So we're going to be working on all those things concurrently. As you can see, we're a main team of three. We're very fortunate to have, we mentioned Reem Shahid, Rachel Riggs, Adrian Bonseca as kind of support networks for us, as well as a lot of other really wonderful collaborators around the world. So as is the spirit of this slow publishing festival, we're working on it.
Exciting. Well, I'll stay tuned, and so should everyone. We just have one last question from our audience asking, what resources would you recommend?
We can start off like a list as far as investigating sound practices. I imagine. I think for I'm thinking of also how we discover new artists, and as Sam was saying, attending festivals. There are so many and so great ones around. Go and find obscure publications like ours, dedicate itself to it. Look at who's your sort of artist are working with. For example, we found incredible collaborations through collaborators of people that we've published together, like we've published with, through visual, through like the visual medium, for example. Thinking of shows put up by collectives, more sort of on the experimental side, I'd say. These are my sources, and add on to yours.
It's a really good question, and I think, of course, again, not to beat a dead horse, but it goes back to why we felt Infrasonica was key in the first place, which is sort of the lack of congregations of resources related to sound. So even just thinking about the wonderful people who've supported us, our work in any way, like the Institution for Post-Natural Studies in Madrid. We previously worked with Delphina Foundation and Gasworks in London, Nottingham Contemporary. But I think Elo really kind of hit it on the head, which is if you like an artist, check out their Instagram, see where they're working, see who they're working with. Go to wherever your local gallery or museum is and ask people if, what they're doing to work with sound. I think there's sort of an industry, we don't like these words, but industry push at the moment to figure out answers to questions like that. So thank you for asking them, and please tell people about us when they ask you.
Yeah,
shameless push there.
I was gonna add to, like, actually, I think Infrasonica's website on its own gives such a wealth of resources and brilliant thinkers, practitioners, and I think it's almost in itself a very extensive archive of very cross-disciplinary thinkers, artists, or writers, theorists. So I think, yeah, do definitely check out the website if you haven't. And that's all the questions from the audience, and also from myself. Thank you so much to Sam and Eloise and Pablo, who unfortunately had to leave earlier. But yeah, we will stay tuned for your upcoming projects. They all sound super, super exciting. And I hope that, this conversation project can continue, and then we'll get to see more from you guys very soon.
Thank you so much for having us, for the invitation. We look forward to working together in the future.
And thank you for all the questions. They were very spot on. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the ones in the audience for staying with us and listening today. And if you have any, follow-up questions, feel free to get in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.